we fight against another athlete in a space that we have to consider. And this reality is important to be considered also during the training part.
I think boxers want to do upper body because they feel strong, but they just don't understand the connection of the kinematic sequence. So they don't really fully understand how it all comes together.
You see people are either training in such non-specific ways, or they choose things that look just like the sport, thinking that that's going to have transfer to the sport. And you can understand that line of reasoning and the logic, but it doesn't always hold up that way.
We can consider this approach to understand if today our athlete is ready to be loaded in the way we minded before meeting him.
When you have combat athletes, it's like Russian roulette on the run up to the fight, because injuries, you just can't avoid them.
But you're not fit enough to do low intensity running. So if you want to go jog for 30 minutes at an easy effort, we could have you do that, but we know it's not really low intensity, or we could have you go bike or do some other modality.
This is how we're judging fighters, dehydrated like skeletons on the scales. And that is insane to me, that's we're in the 21st century, we're still seeing this and we're not understanding the ramifications of dramatic weight costs.
Being capable to maintain the homeostasis of the body during all the phases of the training, during all the path coming on to the match.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. Okay, guys, welcome to you all on the podcast. Evan, Andrew, and Guglielmo. I've been lucky enough to all have you on the podcast before, and we thought it might be a good idea to do a little roundtable here and try to talk in a bit more detail about all things combat sports, physiology, performance, and so here we are. So maybe for those who don't know who you guys are, Evan, I'll let you start. Andrew, you'll go second. Gug third. Just give us a quick synopsis of who you are, what you do, and how that relates to combat sports in general.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a physiologist. I work with biotech companies, sports teams, and military, primarily doing research and development. And I also work for a company called Training Think Tank, where I work one-on-one with athletes. Most of my involvement in combat sports is from a consultant standpoint, so doing a little bit more of the traditional physiologic testing and trying to fill in some of those gaps. And hopefully today we'll talk about why or why not that is relevant at different points in time. These two gentlemen, I think, probably have much more experience with the specifics of the actual combat, which I do not have.
Okay, Andrew.
So I'll let them pick it up.
Andrew, go for it.
Okay, so I have my own company, Evolve Performance, where we do sports science and exercise physiology. I'm also the sports scientist for Northern Sporting Club for the pro boxers. So we've got a range of pro boxers, but previously I also worked with UFC fighters, Bellator fighters, K1, and for a lot of years was active in a whole different sphere of kind of combat sports. But the last few years has predominantly been boxing for me, back to boxing. So yeah.
Fantastic. Gug?
Here we are. Good afternoon, everybody. I met my head coach in team scheduling with boxer at university. Coach Valerio Esposito is the head coach of young national team boxing for Italia team, and he was a colleague of mine during university years. And now we are working together in assessment and in clinical reasoning for best practice in training and in therapeutic exercise for national teams boxers.
Fantastic. So actually, Google, we'll start with you since you just talk about testing and assessing boxers. We'll start with boxing, and we can always go around on different combat sports when the opportunity comes up. But so Gug, how do you view the assessment process for a boxer? A boxer comes into your gym, they want to, get better at their sport. What's the starting point for you? What do you do? And off of this, I invite Andrew and Evan to then bounce off of Gug's ideas and try to add maybe a piece to the puzzle, or maybe ask some questions or give some other opinions. I really want this conversation to be as open as possible. We're, I think, all here to learn and exchange. So Gug, take it away and go at it.
Thank you, Sean. I think that during these years, in Italy and all over the world, the community of sports scientists in combat sports started minding about a lot of questions about what we have done during the previous period. For example, when we start training a boxer or a combat sport athlete in general, what we have to think about for the best practice for the first goals during his training path. Studying physiotherapy after athletic training, I starting think about the idea that what we are thinking about assessment can be changed if we change the point of view. For example, if we start thinking about, or we can say around, the sport physiology model, I can lose something during the path, starting from the single subject physiological and biomechanical model, due to I don't know if my young athlete or if my former athlete can show his potential, considering his motor control, considering his biomechanical model, due to we know today that biomechanical and motor control can affect the physiology of the sport gesture, the physiology of the match intensity in a short or in a long period.
So, sorry to cut you off. So if I understand correctly, you essentially want to see if they can move properly and move well, so that the movement that's executed is going to be efficient, so that the physiology that we're then going to measure actually makes sense to be measured. Because let's talk crudely, if they move like shit, they're going to be inefficient and they're going to waste a whole bunch of energy in their movement, and it's not necessarily valuable at that point to quantify what's going on from the physiological standpoint. You need to make sure first that they can punch and they can move. Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Exactly.
Andrew, do you use the same perspective when you assess the boxers? You have a kind of a movement first approach before you go into the energetics?
Yeah. So if we have someone new come in that, or even for consultancy, because we get a lot of them, the first thing we'll do is always look at a movement assessment. And the reason with this is twofold. One is you want to make sure they have a full range of motion and it's not impaired. But the other is a lot of times they're coming in from different S&C backgrounds. So they have different S&C coaches. So you never know what that S&C coach is necessarily doing with that particular athlete. So a lot of times what we want to look at is what work's being done, what range of motion is there, and just get an overview of just kind of where they are. So we do it's kind of more a kind of physio style assessment. we're looking to make sure, you know, that we can plantar flex and get range dorsiflexion and all these things, so that in the strength conditioning phase, we know they can get to the bar properly. There's no issues with scapular winging and all these sort of things. So we do that first. Then off the back of that, we will have them just even simply shadow box, just to see whether the movement is there and the position's there and the hip position's there. And then we'll slowly start moving into more physiological tests. But curiously, most people fail in the movement assessment, because a lot of times when boxers are with S&C coaches that don't understand the sport, they're maybe doing back squatting 2.5 times body weight or crazy things, and the alignment's completely off for the needs of the sport. So a lot of times they actually fail it, which is always quite interesting. But yeah, movement first. Yeah, big
moving first. Evan, in your consultancy work, is that something that you've spoken to the coaches about? Is it something that they pay attention to? Obviously, like you said, you're not the sport expert in that context, but is that still something that you mention to the coaches before you go and see what's going on under the hood?
Yes, that's something that we do always talk about. And one of the conversations that comes up often is the degrees of freedom that athletes do or don't have as a product of injuries that they've sustained. So I'm sure we all know what good technique looks like in these movement patterns that we're thinking about biomechanical efficiency in. But sometimes you're faced with the harsh reality that a lot of these athletes are never going to optimize their biomechanical efficiency because of injuries they've sustained, ACL reconstructions they've had. So a lot of times it's trying to take those constraints and figure out where we could create other degrees of freedom to get them moving as well as they can. And then at that level, we just need to start focusing on metabolic efficiency and some of these other factors, knowing that the movement could only progress so much. And you see the same thing with military as well. Guys have not always combat sustained injuries, but a lot of times it's the selection process just gets these guys injured, and they've sustained these things for so long that on some level, if this guy's like stuck in a crazy kyphotic position, he might just be there, and we need to work with that as best as we can.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And since we're on the topic of injuries and let's call them biomechanical limitations, maybe for Guga and Andrew, what are the biggest limitations that you see with boxers coming to you? What are the how to say that, the least taken care of movements that they should be able to execute properly, that they should be able to do in order to then either be efficient at the gym or be efficient at their sport? But usually from what you can see, they're just not there yet. Guga, I'll let you go first.
Okay. This is a very interesting topic due to working with young boxers and some former boxers. I can see during these years a different approach in our forming boxing school. I can say, for example, 2 years ago we had the possibility to assess one Olympic Italian boxer. He was 35 years old, and we can see that the path we had in training the specific endurance was very, very, very out from the sport physiological gesture. For example, during endurance test and on at the bag, he presented the same graph of VO2 max in front of the heart rate. And it is a very, very strange perspective for me due to this athlete isn't able to go on into the application of intensity with his punching. So he is a perfect adaptation like a middle distance runner, but he isn't capable to perceive his possibility to go on in effort. And speaking with this athlete, he said that during every training phases is usually to run a lot in the morning before the specific training on the ring in the afternoon. We have a different scenario with young boxers, and in this period, they usually have formed in strength and conditioning but here, in this moment in Italy, we are minding around the possibility to assess the right external load to train this young athlete, and assessing and observing kinetic chain of this boxer, we can say that a lot of these young athletes usually use in a good way the upper limb, but they cannot able to use the lower limb into the specific gesture of the punch. And this is a very limiting coordinative factor, limiting coordinative factor on the ring. Due to these young athletes cannot able to use the space, cannot able to pitch the possibility to impress the match with more activity and more intensity. So we are speaking and we are minding about the possibility to assess the single subject capabilities, thinking about strength, power, lactic acid mechanism, but at the same time, it's important considering the other factor, how the athlete can perceive part of his body, how the athlete can perceive his position in the space, how the athlete can consider the position and the action of the other boxer during the match. During the last 20 years, our Italian school is very concentrated around the single athlete, the single boxer. But we have to consider that we fight against another athlete in a space that we have to consider. And this reality is important to be considered also during the training path, I think. Thinking about the idea of elaborate specific exercise using the ring space can be the same thing that in the football strength and conditioning coach used for small-sided games with the aim to train specific endurance, for example.
Yeah,
this is the way we are going on now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to come back to that Google later on. And when you spoke about, so you spoke about maybe an older boxer or someone who trained kind of old school and did a lot of running, and it was kind of training for as a runner to then try to be good in the ring, which at face value doesn't make a ton of sense if we think about, you know, transfer and specificity. And you also talked about the lower limbs, Andrew. That's something you talked quite a bit about when we had our chat on the podcast, the importance of leg strength in boxing, the importance of knowing how to use your legs. So that kind of comes together. Is that something that you see as well in boxers, the inability or lack of ability to control the lower part of their body when it boxing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, we become very upper body dominant, I think, in S&C for boxing. You see a lot of landmine, med ball throws. One of the things we see quite a lot when people come in is the inability to be stable on one side. There's always a lot of asymmetrical issues. And that's going to happen in the sport anyway, given the stance and the position. But we tend to find a lot of times the legs are probably not as strong as they should be, or in the case of an athlete that has really good, strong legs, they don't utilize them properly. So we spend a lot of time on single leg work and just making sure both sides come together, and we'll plug into the nerves thing later on that. But that's a key thing. I think my kind of feeling is we spend a lot of time, I think boxers want to do upper body because they feel strong, but they just don't understand the connection of the kinematic sequence. So they don't really fully understand how it all comes together. But when your landmine presses and are throwing, it feels good and it looks good, but it doesn't necessarily transfer over. But going back to the ring, it's a really important thing. And I'll explain why, because we obviously had a couple of kids, well, not kids around 20s, but everyone's a kid to me, but competing for world title fights just a few weeks ago, and the ring was small. You know, I mean, it was meant to be a 21-foot ring. It did not feel like that. And it made a big difference probably to Billy and Dean's performance, even though it was good and Dean obviously won. But that small half step back was a massive difference in space and time for him, because he was much closer to the ropes than we anticipated. And if you're training an Olympic size ring and you go down to a smaller ring, then it can have cognition-wise and spatial awareness-wise, massive effects. And then what happens is they start to shorten up the stance, start to see kind of stability issues. Or if it's a bigger ring and they've been competing smaller, you start to see overextension. It does play a big factor. And I think it is something, I think Doug's right, that we're now spending a lot more time doing training in the actual ring. So we are simulating as much as possible in the ring size they're going to be competing in. Whereas previously we may have shadow box or even done pad sessions just in the floor area. But now we're kind of trying to dial it in a lot more.
Yeah, like Gug said before, if you translate that to field sport, it makes total sense to play with the constraints that you're going to be faced with during the actual competition in order to be ready. And we don't necessarily, I never thought about the size of a ring, but I mean, it makes sense now that you guys talk about it. You know, if you have a few extra feet of space or not, that changes the way you see things. It changes maybe your strategy during the fight of how you're going to move forward or move back, retreat left and right. And so you have to consider those, let's say, specific competition parameters in your preparation. And again, I want to come back to that. And staying on the legs for a bit, Evan, in the testing that you've done, whether it's boxers or other combat sport athletes, is that something that you see maybe some relative, let's say, weaknesses on the lower body relative to their upper body?
Yeah, so that is one issue I see, but I do want to follow up on something Andrew said as well that was really like awesome tie-in. So Guglielmo's talking about a lot of people traditionally they'll do running, like they kind of train like Rocky, if you've ever seen those movies, where it's like, yeah, we're gonna run, we're gonna hold weights in our hands and punch because it looks cool and it seems like it would have carryover. And then Andrew was mentioning a lot of people, they'll try and get more specific and they'll choose exercises that look like fighting. So they'll do like landmine push presses, and he had mentioned that it looks great, but it doesn't necessarily have the right transfer over. So that's something that I'm always trying to think about for these sports, because you see people are either training in such non-specific ways, or they choose things that look just like the sport, thinking that that's going to have transfer to the sport. And you can understand that line of reasoning and the logic, but it doesn't always hold up that way. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about for fighting, and Andrew and I have talked about this a little bit via email earlier when I just started dabbling in this, and it's still an ongoing thing that I'm looking into, is when we're trying to find exercises that actually have carryover and help these athletes, it's not enough for an exercise to look like the pattern. It's really about whether it challenges the neuromuscular system in the same way. So for example, if we were to take a fighter and we put some SEMGs on like the delt, tricep, glute, calf, quad, and we have them throw kicks, throw punches, and we could see what those neuromuscular recruitment patterns look like, and we can look at the rectified amplitudes on an EMG. What we could then do is try and find what that individual athlete's kinematic pattern looks like, and then find assistance exercises that replicate that for that individual based on what their own specific movement profile looks like. So you could create very specific exercises for assistance, but what's specific for me punching is going to be different than what's specific for you punching, because our limb lengths are different. We execute our movement different. But then touching on lower body specifically, that is something I see all the time. But one of the biggest issues I see, this because I haven't done much work with boxers, a lot of it has been with mixed martial artists, Brazilian jiu-jitsu athletes, and a little bit of wrestlers, which was my sport background. I wrestled for 8 years. Is they have knee injuries, and almost all these cases are ankle injuries that end up impairing their vasodilator capacity in those tissues. So for me, the quickest thing that we spot, that their coaches spot, is that they're weak on one of their legs, but it's that they're also non-responsive to training. So they have like this one tiny quad or like a tiny calf on one side, and you're like, what is this? And you're like, have you ever done any exercising on this leg? And they're like, oh yeah, I do a ton of training, but I'm just not responding. It's when you actually start to look at those tissues, you realize that they've impaired perfusion in those tissues. So they can't get blood into the tissue. They can't vasodilate. They can't utilize oxygen properly. So a lot of what I end up doing with these athletes is essentially trying to figure out how do we restore this function, so then they could go and do normal training, whether it's sport specific or non-sport specific, to get everything back up to par.
Mm-hmm. Evan, when you're looking at those, maybe those limitations, is that where you would pull out some thermography and try to look at left to right differences?
Yeah, so thermography is always like the quick and easy stop to get a quick check engine light. So typically what I'll do is we'll do the thermography screen. And with that specific type of issue where vasodilator capacity is impaired, that usually looks like a hypothermic region. So you see like a big cold spot in the tissue. And a lot of times it's exaggerated enough that if you kind of put your fingers on and touch the tissue, it feels a little bit icy compared to the other side. And for me, as soon as I see that, I'm like, oh, gold mine, like we know exactly what to do with this. And it means that it could be because they've disrupted fiber structure. Like if they got an ACL graft, they have to go in there and kind of carve things out. Or it could just be due to a chronic injury, but they essentially can't get blood into that tissue properly. And then we'll follow up and we'll use a moxie and see if that corroborates what we're finding. And if that's the case, if they are able to utilize oxygen in that tissue, what you see is that they can't increase blood flow to that tissue in response to that deoxygenation. So a lot of times that leg will fatigue quicker. It doesn't handle training well. So it's not like super complicated process. Like you could teach this to any coach. You just give them a piece of equipment, but it's just a matter of knowing what you're looking for there.
Yeah, Gug, is that something that you look at as well? Knees, blood flow in the lower limbs, and how that might affect the boxing performance?
Absolutely, absolutely. What Evan had said now is a very, very, very important and useful aspect of what we can change immediately before training or immediately before a warm-up specific for a match too. For example, if we consider a school of ideas all around breathing works or a physiotherapy before training school and approach considering blood flow restriction, we can see that blood flow restriction for manual therapy and breathing works teaching by coaches to athletes can improve venous return, considering exactly what Evan has just said now. I think that this is a good strategy to improve an acute response before a specific training, before a specific exercises on the ring, before sparring, or before a match. Is a very, very important aspect, I think. We can use Moxie in this way to see a very, very, very fast and accurate response into the same body district before and after strategy like that. And we can consider this approach to understand if today our athlete is ready to be loaded in the way we minded before meeting him. For example, if after briefing works, we can see with Moxie that the venous return is better, we are okay. But we can see with Moxie that this situation cannot be happen, and we can reschedule the starting of our training in this way. So
Yes.
use of thermography, use of Moxie, using of a kind of approach like this is very, very important, I think, because we have the strategy. We only have to use it.
Exactly. So talk auto regulation of training, and that's I wrote it down. I want to come back to it. While we're on the lower body, I do want to talk about running for boxing as such. Gug, you talked about people doing too much running style running as boxers. How much? And Andrew, I'll let you start with that one. How much running is enough for a boxer? How much running is too much for a boxer?
So I have changed my opinion on this because for a long, long time I was very much not a big fan of long, steady state running because I didn't want to put any extra stress fractures or shin splints or and too much skipping or running and things like this. But I've accepted over the years that some athletes want to run. That's just their nature. That's what they want to do. And I want to go back to something that Evan was talking about as well because I think it's really important that when you have combat athletes, it's like Russian roulette on the run up to the fight because injuries you just can't avoid them. We had the situation just not long ago where, you know, athlete pulls an ATFL and it's kind of like 2 weeks out the title fight, and you have to kind of just work on about that, and it is difficult. And so yes, I think that's a really important thing. But going back to the running, I think some of our boxers don't like to run. That's just that they just don't like it, and we don't make them run. So other boxers historically, sometimes actually more the older boxers in their 30s, historically use it to zone out and just to kind of almost like a meditation or a mindfulness moment. So I know as we let them do it, just because as long as it's not impacting performance, it's not impacting training too much, we're okay with it. But you do have those that have serious ankle issues that want to run, that you have to say to them, like, this is probably not the best thing for you to be doing. Why don't we put it onto something else? And that's a harder sell. So my opinions could change. I like, you know, so example, we do 5K runs. And the reason we do 5K runs on a Monday is a lot of times I'm very remote, so I can't get access to the athletes. So a lot of them like to challenge themselves on a Monday morning and try and, you know, we'll benchmark beginning of the 8 weeks. You know, then we have a 25-minute 5K, and usually in a fight week they're doing about 17 minutes. You know, and they like that because, and the other thing, psychologically, they like the fact they can get their run done there and then, and it's a 20-minute run and it's done for the morning. And a lot of times we're actually just using that as part of a, you know, like a train high, sleep low protocol nutritionally. So it's just to get that extra kind of fat oxidation. So yeah, so we still use running, but not probably to the same extent as some other gyms. Some other gyms have got some 100-mile runs happening middle of the week, end of the week, some serious mileage. But even with some of the military people we work with some military as well. You know, they're obviously big on tactical assault battles and everything else. You know, even with those, we're trying to kind of get them to cut it back a little bit, because it does put a lot of stress on the body. But I'm not adverse running anymore. People used to think I was. I've changed my tune. I'm not adverse running. Everything in moderation. But if the athlete likes it and it's something psychologically that gives them a performance boost, I don't want to take it away. If it's an athlete that really doesn't want to run, that will affect performance, it'll affect psychology, so I will take it away from them and we'll put something else in place. So it's just about the individual, really, for me, at the end of the day.
I have a question for Andrew, speaking about running and training for boxing. What do you think about the possibility to consider a specific strategy with running to improve cardiac output, to transfer it in a specific sport gesture for the boxing? For example, what do you think about the possibility to use hill sprinting or acceleration exercises for sprinter into the boxer training?
So we will always, at points of camp, measure cardiovascular function and VO2 and things like this. And then off the back of that, and rest and heart rate and recovery, and then we will prescribe cardiac output training if we need it in the particular phase. So yeah, so we use it, and hill sprinting, yeah, we'll use it if we need to use it. So yeah, I don't have a problem with that. We actually do a lot with fighters that may be returning from injury. We do a lot of cardiac output training. So, and we'll do that we'll obviously kind of just go through the usual kind of lab style testing, and we'll kind of try and zone them adequately for that, and then implement that. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. How do you use running much in terms of the endurance component? Do you have other methods that you prefer to apply for your boxers?
Yes, we are considering the possibility to use during the training path this kind of running strategy as a specific way to improve VO2 max, and in particular to improve motor control for specific gesture. For example, if my athlete can be able to improve his acceleration during sprinting exercise, he may be more able to pitch the ring during punching activity. And into the next future, we want to measure it using EMG and using motion capture to understand if we can able to transfer an ability like to be able to start better for a sprint into the punching activity or into the explosive power enhancement. This is what we are minding around. And this is the matter due to I want to ask Andrew what he think about the possibility to use this kind of running exercises as a specific strategy that can support specific activity for the ring.
So my issue is a lot of the athletes are doing unsupervised running, and some of them have very poor running technique. So my concern is, should we be fixing running gait? And therefore then does that have an effect on their existing performance? I need to look at more research on it. I'm not, the VO2 max is an interesting one because obviously it's something I'm doing my systematic review on, and I've got mixed feelings on the relevance of VO2 max from graded exercise versus, you know, practical field testing. I'm not adverse to the idea. I can see where you're coming from running and gait, motion transferring over to say striking. I would be tending to want to maybe use more coordinated striking drills in favor of it, just because I would be concerned. It's maybe just our athletes are not very good runners. They can run really fast, but they do run very bizarrely at times. So, and I'm not a running coach per se, so I'm just a bit apprehensive about how we would facilitate that, but I'm not opposed to it. So yeah.
That's I think those are some good ideas. Google, I like the idea of, especially you mentioned the hill sprints, and I can see that the line of push, the line of drive, having some semblance to what you would see, like you guys have talked about before. You punch from the ground up, and so seeing that go through the sprint, and then seeing that, can we see that go through a punch afterwards? And if we think about the time domain or the speed of movement that we're executing, a sprint is definitely what's going to come the closest to the punch, even though I'm not sure which one's the fastest, and what's the fastest limb movement in a early phase acceleration or in a punch. That would be an interesting one. Evan, if we stay on the running, how do you, or if we just stay on we talked about a little bit of endurance, a little bit of power development here with the running. How do you like to approach conditioning for your combat athletes?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that I think about conditioning, let's lump all of the traditional terms like VO2 max, critical power, aerobic capacity, let's just call those one thing and envision that as the size of a big cup. Your VO2 max is going to be the size of your cup, but ultimately you need to fill that cup with water. And we could think about that as like your sport specific qualities. So for me, I know that someone's going to perform to the level of their high water mark. What is their sport specific qualities going to allow them to do? But they're going to be constrained by that cup size ultimately. So if we take two guys, we have one fighter, let's say he's a boxer and his VO2 max is 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute. One, he probably picked the wrong sport. But hypothetically, let's say he wants to fight. He has this ridiculously high VO2 max, but he moves like complete shit when he's boxing. So the cup's huge and it's pretty much empty. There's very little water in it. Then we have another boxer. He's never run more than 2 miles in his life. His VO2 max is 55 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So a nice stout cup, but it's full all the way to the brim because he's really developed this sport specific technique. He's going to wreck the other guy. But then if that short, stout cup guy goes head to head with another boxer whose VO2 max is 70 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and they've got some nasty skills and their cup is at the high water mark, they're going to beat that other guy. So you could see that it really becomes a game of like, what is your own limiter? If you're already very conditioned, your VO2 max is high, you're fit, I don't really care what modality you're doing for your conditioning because it might not matter anyway. You probably need to focus on more of these sport-specific competencies, where if you're the fighter who's been in the game for a long time, your striking power is great, your mind for the sport, understanding where you should be in the ring, your tactics, your technique, all of these things are great, but you're of a low conditioning level, then you have to increase that cup size. So for each person, we're always trying to figure out, do we make the cup bigger or do we fill the cup up more? And if we are trying to make the cup bigger, I'm fine if we use running, rowing, biking, because it's non-specific. But one of the things that I always consider with running is the person even fit enough to use running as a training modality with all these different intensities? And the example that I always think of when I ultimately transitioned from wrestling to running full time in cross country and track. But initially I'd started cross country running to prepare for the wrestling season, which is in the winter in North America. And the first time I showed up at cross country practice, the coach said, "Hey, we're going to go on a 8-mile run at a 7-minute 30 pace or an 8-minute pace. And it's going to be our moderate effort run." I was like, "What the hell is this guy talking about? We're going to run 8 miles at a 8-minute mile pace." So I wasn't fit enough to run at that speed and have that actually be a recovery pace. And of course you could say, well, just run slower. But the issue that we run into is if you're running any slower than like a 9:30 mile pace, you're no longer running. You're just bouncing in place with a lot of vertical displacement. And now you're opening yourself up to injury because there's going to be a lot of mechanical forces through the lower legs. So if I'm thinking like a boxer and they want to do a lot of their conditioning running, but they're not a very good runner, I'd say let's do some of your moderate to high intensity work running. But you're not fit enough to do low intensity running. So if you want to go jog for 30 minutes at an easy effort, we could have you do that, but we know it's not really low intensity, or we could have you go bike or do some other modality. So because I'm not married to any of these specific types of training, I'm always just thinking, do we even need to improve your conditioning? If we do, what's like the lowest cost item? Because the funny thing is, in a sport, you could be that guy that needs to improve the conditioning and you might get your VO2 max really high. But if you haven't filled up your watermark or the other guy's high knockout power, the fight might only last 20 seconds anyway, if we're thinking for mixed martial arts, for example. So it sometimes doesn't even matter how conditioned you are. If the fight's not going to go long enough for you to even like get to 25% of your VO2 max.
Yeah, that was a very, very good point, and I think you illustrated the idea of the efficiency component of performance really well, and again, what portion of that VO2 can you actually leverage in your sport specific endeavors? Andrew, I know you use VO2 testing with your boxers, so maybe just building on what Evan just talked about, how do you use that measure with your boxers when it relates to performance?
So we just want initially the baseline, and it is exactly as Evan said, because you can have boxers that are conditioned, powerful, but lack the fundamental techniques to make things happen in the ring. So, and this happens more than you probably realize, because the whole world out there has opened up to do VO2 max testing. Everywhere does VO2, and a lot of athletes will come in with VO2 scores and they're either disappointed or they're ecstatic about it. But when you actually see them in the ring sparring, what they actually need is boxing training. They need more sport-specific striking training. That's the thing. So I use it predominantly because I can use it, and we want it as a baseline, and then we just want to guide off of it. So, but what is actually more interesting to me is a much more comprehensive field-based approach to this, which is simulating through portable gas analyzers, specific boxing training, looking at VO2 peak between rounds, looking at recovery rates, and making a better judgment on that, along with substrate utilization between rounds than a treadmill test. Mm-hmm. Because we all have seen it with athletes that maybe breathe a little bit better near the end of the test and fudge their test, so they kind of get a little bit better score. There's we've got some competitive athletes who will try and fudge it because they know they can fudge it. So it happens. And I think there's a lot of other things as well, like nutritional value, training loads, inflammation markers can all affect that test as well. So I'm not a massive lover of graded exercise testing per se for boxing. I think field testing is the way to go. But that still gets its own problems as well. But it is something we use. I think it is good knowing what the aerobic capacity is. I think it's very important, but I think it has to be done in context. I think the problem we've got is, and when you look at the research over the last 26 years, there's a massive range, from the low end of 42 all the way up to 65 as a VO2 max score. But when you actually look at it, the people that are winning are in the middle. they're around about 58. So it comes back to that cup idea again as well. Is like over, and it depends your sport as well. Because if you're amateur and you're only over 3 rounds, then you don't need as big, tall a cup necessarily. But if you're a pro going 12 rounds, you need both. So it is a very individual. It is like the old. It reminds me of Sesame Street with Bert and Ernie. Who's got the licorice and they're biting bits off, and it's kind of like, it reminds me of an old episode of that. I was a kid. I think about it quite a lot. So it is all down to individualization, and that you know, if you're and that is quite hard for boxing, because most boxing, especially in the UK, don't have sports scientists attached unless you're super high level. So so it is difficult, but yeah, I think field testing is the way to go. If you can't field test, then I'll take, if somebody comes in with a VO2 score, then it can be, I want the raw data at the very least. I can look at it and say, right, where are you at and where can we build from?
For someone who goes, you know, for maybe an extended 6 rounds, I know you've done some field tests that go fairly long, even longer for your pro boxers, Andrew. What kind of VO2 max values do you see during those field tests compared to a graded exercise running test?
So we've had boxers that have very poor VO2 max scores in the graded exercise test, that maybe are sitting about 47, 48. And when you start looking at VO2 peak and you start looking at those values through the rounds, you're starting to see right about 59 to 62. So there's a big difference in it. But it's apples and oranges because they're 2 different things. Yeah. So, it's intermittent. So there's moments of breaking away. There's get the 1 minute recovery round. So it is a different thing. So I'm hesitant at comparing a graded exercise test straight to a field test. But what I have seen and what we have been able to do, which has been kind of interesting, which will lead into the PhD research later this year, is we have taken from week 1 to week 6. In week 1, we're seeing predominantly carbohydrate utilization in rounds, and then we've seen near the end a massive swap over and fuel utilization, a much more early utilization of fats, and a lot more carbohydrates later on. And we've been playing around with this, and it paid dividends for our latest 2 fights, where the 2 lads were sensationally conditioned. They just went through the 10 rounds at ease. It was a big transition for them. So we're all kind of looking at how substrate really affects, and that ties into everything else, because biomechanics, efficiency affects substrate utilization, and then we're jumping down the massive rabbit hole with no goggles on. So,
and Andrew, how much does like a pre-fight weight cut or like water depletion impact the substrate utilization when they're
massive.
fighting? Massive. Yeah, because I was gonna say, like, you were to do that off season, do you ever have someone like deplete themselves and then test their substrate utilization to replicate a fight?
So since I came on board with Northern Sporting Club a few years ago, we changed weight cutting dramatically. So we no longer water load, we no longer dehydrate. It does mean we take slightly longer to make the cut, which doesn't help when fights come rapidly on. So because of that, we don't have fighters go out with 10% of fight weight. So we're only ever cutting probably 7 kilos tops. So we don't have that issue. In the past, I've seen it though, where obviously as soon as you start to dehydrate, you start to lose kind of sodiums and calciums and everything else, muscle contraction is nowhere near as good as it should be. You start to see cognition issues, you see errors, you see biomechanical impedance, you see a whole massive amount of things occur, but the promoter doesn't care. Yeah. Because as long as they win, it shocks me. We obviously had fights recently. Our fighters made weight super easy. And this is an interesting one. So one of our fighters who won the world title weighed in 1.5 pounds under the weight limit. Okay? So he weighed in 1.5 pounds under the weight limit. He had the best cut he's ever had in his life. This is the first time we've done a proper count on him. He didn't dehydrate. He didn't water load. And the comment, and he won the world title, looked sensational. Just everyone was going, wow, he looks so good, looks so healthy. And yet the promoter said to me, he weighed in light. And I had said, but he said the best performance of his life, and the hydration was perfect. We had him fueling properly. But to the eyes of the promoter and the manager and other people, he weighed in light. And I was thinking, this is how we're judging fighters, dehydrated like skeletons on the scales. And that is insane to me, we're in the 21st century, we're still seeing this, and we're not understanding the ramifications of dramatic weight costs. Now, the other big issue is what does that do long-term to your metabolism if you're 3 times a year making dramatic weight cuts? And that's a scary proposition.
Who the hell knows? Like, that's something I've wondered with wrestlers quite a bit. I worked with some D1 wrestlers a few years ago, and like they're doing some of them significant weight cuts 1 to 2 times a week. So they basically walk around swinging like 15 to 20 pounds up and down on a weekly basis for
Yeah.
months. And then you're like, God, what is the outcome of this long term?
Well, something interesting. So this was the first time we did this. We measured RMR every week during this phase. Now, both of our athletes, the weight cut was really, it was on point. Everything worked. It was a great camp. But we seen so super bantamweight, so 55.3 kilo, around the 55 kilo mark for talk's sake. So it starts camp at 62. RMR is sitting about 2-1, so about 2,100. At the end of the camp, it was 1430.
Wow.
Right, and that's not a good, stable program.
Yeah.
And now he's bounced back up. But it made me consider what's happening with people that are massively crashing to the rest of their body, what's happening to metabolic function long term.
Yeah.
Which is something I'd like to look at, but that's a big longitudinal study that you're looking at having to get an athlete that wants to be with you. But you just think about that massive change and you think, wow,
Yeah,
and you get wrestlers crazy. Just
yeah, now I'm thinking if you want to create a big study out of it, I'm like, God, what IRB is going to approve this anyway? That's probably half the issue. Like, I'm going to pitch you guys the study. We're going to starve people and then have them rapidly regain the weight and then just keep doing it. And in between that, we're going to punch them in the face.
And it's funny as well because so I was looking at all these other fighters, and so obviously our 2-step off the scales, and we've got try to get 80 grams of carbohydrate in them pretty fast and start to slowly hydrate them up. And then I'm watching other people eating, like just garbage. And I'm thinking, big fights your life that could dramatically alter your life one way or the other, or you could end up with a subcutaneous hematoma or some kind of brain bleed because it's a obviously tough sport. And I'm thinking, you've got all these athletes cut, dehydrate, and you're feeding them salty crisps, and I find it difficult to understand. And I'm an old coach, so I'm a dinosaur in the world of coaches. But I still think we live in this idea that your athlete has to be 88 kilos to make 66 kilos because they're going to hydrate back up to 88 kilos and have a size advantage. And time again, that doesn't really come true a lot of times. But what are you doing to your athlete? So your athlete may be 21. So what's he going to be like at 35?
Yeah, I think those are very important considerations. Goog, are you involved in any of the weight cutting, the nutrition side of the performance with your athletes? Can you weigh in on those issues as well?
In our team, we have a nutritional consultant, and we want to know more from this professional to understand better how we can help our athletes to maintain their homeostasis of the body. I was very interested listening what Andrew was spoken about due to he was spoken about one of the most important role of a coach for his athletes, being capable to maintain the homeostasis of the body during all the phases of the training, during all the path coming on to the match. Listening Andrew, I was thinking about what some Olympic athletes said after a good race, after a good match, after a medal obtained. They all said that they feel better with their body during the match, but during the day before the race, the day before the match. So this is a very, very, very important aspect that every coach has to consider when he plan the training period, considering strategies, considering posology, and considering strategy and posology to maintain the best homeostasis of the body of our athlete. And in this melting pot, if I can use this analogy, we have to consider also mental health of our athlete. Due to our athlete suffer often of a very, very big pressure, thinking about the match, thinking about the expectation, thinking about the final result, and using like a measure, a measure, strategy, posology to homeostasis is a very, very important possibility to improve and to maintain mental health, consciousness, awareness of our athlete. So it's a very, very important aspect. I cannot be able to do it like Andrew, but we have a very, very, very able consultant following our athlete in a nutritional path.
Yeah, and it goes back to having a holistic and integrative approach to what you're doing with the athlete. It's not just the boxing side. It's not just the strength and conditioning. It's just not just the nutrition. It's all of the above, all the time, all working together, which does make it infinitely more tricky to dial in and do properly. But at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to achieve, is trying to do the best job as we can as supporting staff for our athletes. Could you weigh in on the VO2 side of what we were talking about a little bit before? I know you've talked about it as well in the context of boxing. So how do you view that parameter? How do you use it with your athletes?
It's fundamental understand this parameter to make sense of consciousness for our athlete. An old teacher of mine usually said that every athlete is his own pilot of his own car, and his own car is his body. So if the pilot cannot understand, cannot know how power is his car, he cannot be able to solve problems during the match. He cannot be able to understand if use a high intensity, a low intensity, to use the space for a better recovery. So assessing VO2 max is one of the fundamental aspects to teach to the athlete how he can use his body to be the best. We usually use metabolimeter such as VO2 master, but here in Italy, our federation use other device from other factory, but we are starting to consider VO2 master for the better relationship between cost and test result than what we now used. And during this kind of test, we can note a lot of differences about the athlete comprehension of the test and how the comprehension of the test can affect the VO2 final measurement. So the same old teacher of mine usually said that if an athlete can be a good can do a good test, always it seems that he can do in the right way that test, but he cannot be related to his real capacity to be powerful, to be intensity. So we now are considering the assessing of some parameter like that, like a way to train with a high consciousness our athlete. But we need devices with more accuracy to be able to use parameter to train better our athletes.
Yeah, so definitely what comes up in my mind when you say this, Gug, is that we are talking about devices that are not readily available to every coach or even every S&C coach or even every performance consultant around the globe, although they are becoming more and more accessible, those devices that we're talking about that allow you to measure what's going on a breath-to-breath basis, outside of a lab, because again, like you guys both said, or all three of you said today, and really highlighted this, the importance of measuring what's going on in your specific sport endeavor, and not on a graded exercise test that is that is performed in a modality that is usually, well, in this case, not even closely related to what you're going to be doing in the ring. Would you guys have is there any way to work with those different ideas that you guys just laid out in the VO2 space without being able to measure those different parameters? Is there something that can be done, let's say empirically, for coaches and athletes out there that want to do a better job of training, but maybe don't have access to those tools?
This is a good question from you. Due to, I think that another important aspect of our way of working is understand if during this training of this day we are really focusing and reaching the goal. For example, 3 days ago, I assessed my athlete to understand if this level of intensity for training VO2 max is right. But today, 3 days after, this is the right intensity to train my athlete for this goal. This is a very, very important question due to, I think that is more important the right planning of the training during the days to be able to reach the goal I consider important for my athlete performance improving. And using some different devices to understand today how limiting factor can affect the performance during the training of my athletes is fundamental. For example, I using Moxie during warm-up exercises to understand if the venous return is good today, to understand if I can start the training like I thought 3 days before after that test. And another important aspect is considering the possibility to understand how the range of motion can affect the first part of the training. For example, if 3 days ago I assessed my aerobic capacity, the day after I had a very, very, very intensity weight room session, the third day I want to coming back training for the aerobic capacity, but I have to assess also the range of motion after the weight room session, due to I can have the necessity to warm up longer for a better capillarization, for a better vascularization, to be able to start the focusing of the training with the right coordination of all the systems. So it's important assessing, but I think it's important measuring during the training. For example, when Andrew spoke about the VO2 master, I think that it may be wonderful know how the VO2 level of our athlete is changing during the training phases, to understand and to make real the possibility to improve the intensity if my athlete isn't able to understand if his fatigue level perceived is real or not. For example, another important assumes I consider every day is what Louis Gifford said during his exercise lessons. He usually said that what I feel like level of pain of what I feel like fatigue level can be different respect what I can do. And a coach had the role to make his athlete real conscious about the real possibility to go on and to cross over the fatigue um, perception. And I think that using device during the training is a very, very, very big friend for a coach to make his athlete real conscious about his daily possibility. Too much factor can affect the athlete sensation. Another important reflection I want to share with you this afternoon is what in Italy some physics teachers consider for team sports. And I found the same reality also in combat sports. This researcher, physics researcher, not sport researcher, but physics researcher, say that in team sports, emotional factor that the player can find during the matches isn't used during the training and during the week. And I think that this is the same condition for combat sports. When our athlete is on the ring, is able to do the best he can, also with emotional factor, because he wants to win. During the week, his level of fatigue perceived, his level of pain perceived can affect the final result. And to cross over this reality, devices like Moxie, devices like metabolimeter, devices like inclinometer can be a very, very, very important help and friends for coaches, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And like you said, it's definitely very helpful to be able to quantify all those things. I'll extend the same question that I had for you, Gug. I'll extend that one to Evan first. Evan, if you went to go and work with a combat athlete right now and you didn't have access to all those tools that we're fortunate to be able to work with, how would you approach the matter? Would you approach it any differently than what you do now, Evan?
Yeah, so I'm gonna cheat and answer this question first, and I'll give a non-cheating answer. My cheating answer would be, does this athlete live within the proximity of like a university? Because obviously all four of us were fortunate that we have access to a lot of these tools on a regular basis, but I know a lot of athletes, they don't want to buy these things, their coaches might not want to, but a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of times these tools are sitting on a shelf 25 miles or 15 kilometers from their home, and they're very cheap to rent out or have a researcher use on them. So a lot of universities these days have metabolic analyzers and Moxies off the shelves, and you could often pay 10, 15, $20 to go in and get tested for the day. So I actually do that with athletes a lot. I'll say, hey, where do you live? What's your address? I'm going to see what universities are near you, and I'm going to look up their human performance laboratories and see if they offer this to the public. Then in those cases, I'll just have the athletes go and get tested in those ways. If that's not an option, then I'll say, what is the lowest cost tech that we could get some information from? It might not be the best information. So even if someone could spend $20 and get a pulse oximeter, I could have them do their high intensity exercise and say, hey, do you have exercise induced arterial hypoxemia? Do you have these huge drops in SpO2? If so, we know you have some form of respiratory limitation. I don't know why you have a respiratory limitation because I don't have any other data, but you could at least get these little like pin drops on the map to orient yourself with these varying levels of cost. But if that's not an option at all, the way that I tend to think about it is prior to any of us having access to any of these technologies, we've all gotten people fitter at some point or another. So if you imagine where you're at right now, take all these things that you know using the tech, what would you tell yourself back then when you would never access the tech? You would say, hey, I know you're already getting people fitter, but I know some things that you don't know from using this tech. And this is what I would do to augment the programs that you're already writing. So in those scenarios, I very much think in that context, I think, well, what are the things that I know work for these athletes if I know they need to improve X, Y, or Z variable? And by virtue of having used this equipment and spotting some patterns in the data, could I make some educated guesses or extrapolations? So if we're talking about, Sean said we're working with this combat athlete, I'm like, okay, this dude's conditioning is terrible. So we'll look at him, we'll say, do you know how to breathe properly? Like, what do your breathing mechanics look like? Oh, that's good. Okay, well, It's not a breathing issue. What do your positions look like? Okay, you're good there. Okay, well, based off of these maybe intuition or some extraneous data points, I think that you might have a cardiorespiratory limitation and you have really good oxygen utilization. I'm going to give you a protocol that I know for most people improves their cardiorespiratory fitness, and I'm going to try and tailor it to you in whatever like point of care way that I can. Then we'll just see what happens. Did you get fitter? If so, we know that we identified some kind of rate limiter and we got you better. We might not know why. If that protocol didn't do anything for you, I probably guessed wrong or I underdosed the protocol. So really what I was just trying to get at is I think as long as a coach is being mindful, you can do a lot with very little. And it really just comes down to putting in the work and it's like formulate a working hypothesis, see what the results are, and then take notes. And over time, you need to like build a theory of the athlete and you could contextualize and interpret all the data in light of that. That's just going to take some practice and some legwork on the coach's end, but I do think it's definitely doable. And then over time, if they do that enough, maybe they'll build up enough of a client base that they could start to get like the cheapest useful piece of tech, maybe like a Moxie or something, then maybe eventually get a gas analyzer and get more sophisticated as they go.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, what would you do if you didn't have all the toys that you have?
So this has kind of come up quite recently with me with a coach, and I had suggested to them that they could use like because the military and the police have been this for years, is just a bleep test to do a basic VO2 max off a normalized data. So that's one way, cheap way of doing a test. The other is there's quite a good free app for doing the counter movement jump. So that could be a good starting point for them to get some kind of basic kind of power metrics and kind of peak velocity. And I'm not sure how.
Go check it out.
Yeah. You know, we use kind of force plates and things, but that's a cheap way of doing it. So I mean, there's lots of ways to do physiological testing that's got no cost involved as a baseline, as long as you understand the limitations in it and you're using it just to look at before and after. Then I think, you know, we all probably started that way. I mean, everyone as an undergrad's done a shuttle test run repeatedly because that was, you know, the big thing. And I think it's, you know, for me, it's the more I do the research, the more less is more. I think we can go overkill with data. I mean, I'm prone to go overkill with data. If you speak to our coach, David, he hates the PDF write-ups. You know, we do a training session on Thursday, Friday and a Saturday, and he'll be like, don't send that to me over the weekend. Because it's just like full of blah, 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 blah. So you can get a little bit overboard. But I think starting coaches or young coaches are coaches that, and let's face it, combat sports generally, a lot of coaches are volunteers, or they'll set up small gyms, they'll set up small box gyms like the old CrossFit style. They don't have a lot of income to spend on gas analyzers or Moxie sensors. So there's lots of things they can do. You know, you can do sprawl testing, you can there's a whole heap of things you can do to get baseline physiology. And I always say to athletes, buy a heart rate monitor. Super cheap, really super cheap. Polar H10, really cheap, or one of the other brands out there. So yeah, there's ways of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, we shouldn't just always go for the most expensive tech and try to use that and I think you guys all gave some really practical considerations to take into account when training boxers and other combat athletes, maybe areas of training that are usually overlooked and that should be kind of dialed in a little bit better all around. Like you said, less is more. Andrew, I want to talk now about the Moxie. I know all three of you guys use it quite a bit, and so I wanted to hear each one of your perspectives on how you guys integrate the Moxie when it comes to assessing and then into the training part as well for some of you for combat sport athletes. So Gog, I'll let you take that one first.
Moxie becomes fundamental during our working with boxer during the last two years. Due to we can understand that using a Moxie monitor, we can understand better how using external load in the weight room too. For example, training in weight room upper limbs, and is very, very useful to understand how we can modulate the parameter of specific exercises at the bag or during sparring. We usually prefer using Moxie to evaluate deltoid muscle, pectoral muscle, and erector spine muscle. Is important considering, I think, the function of spine muscle during some phases of sparring exercises. Due to, we know that erector spine is an inspiratory muscle too, and considering the point of changing of mobility between the complex of thorax and the lumbar spine, we can understand with Moxie when the athlete is capable to go on in this effort during sparring or not. And when we want to make finished our athlete, we ask to go on, and at the end of the exercise, when we can see on the graph that the SMO2 is equal to 0, and it's happened that we had athlete with this capability, they said that they try to breathe in, but they cannot capable to do it, and they not capable to punch again or to move fast far from the other boxer. So we considering now Moxie fundamental for all we doing in into the training, starting from the weight room, passing to the bag, passing to the ring for different aims, but is fundamental.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know, Andrew, we've spoken about it at length, and you actually do a lot of work with the lower limbs with the Moxie. So yeah. I see some complementarity here, if that's even an English word, I'm not sure, between the two, where you could work more on the upper body or look at the upper body. You could also look at the lower body. So Andrew, how do you use the Moxies with your boxers?
So we use them pretty much for everything to capture baseline data through. I mean, the reason I purchased them was I was kind of interested in looking at modeling to look at rates of fatigue, along with kind of fat max modeling during sparring sessions, because obviously in sparring you're very limited in what you can actually have on you, and we get quite a lot of good world-class sparring at our gym. So I was just very intrigued to see, could we, and this is basically the basis of what we do in the PhD, is look at, can we do correlations between the VO2 max through gas analysis through bag sessions and excuse me, and bike sessions, and then sparring sessions, and put together a whole total metabolic profile, and I guess try and redefine in boxing what bioenergetics really means, and go away from that old horrible model that everyone wants to use. So I have found in sparring it's very difficult to clean data, sometimes from the erector spinae and sometimes from the intercostals. As much as I'd love to get that, it's just not a great place. It could be the style of sparring that we perhaps do. So we've been using a lot on the rec fem and a lot on the gastroc, and we're putting a lot on the calf muscles because we're interested in the push-off motion on the back foot and all the acceleration phase. But we are also using it quite tactically in sparring. So we have two opponents hooked up to it, and we'll play devil's advocate, and we'll go between each of the athletes, and we'll have a look at if one's maybe too heavy in the back leg and we're starting to see problems there and they're maybe unable to come forward. We're telling the other kid to batter them on the way back, and we're conversely doing it the other way around to try and, you know, educate the fighters and how they feel, because I think you have to get that nice connection about how they actually feel in sparring and what physiologically is occurring. And Goog's talked about this previously, which is an excellent way of using it. A lot of times your athlete feels maybe the spar round two's not went their way, so they come quite dejected to the corner, but physiologically there's plenty of gas in the tank, but psychologically the spars just doesn't feel like it's going well. So we're able to educate them now and say, look, there's your screen, you're lying, shut up, get back in there, let's turn it around. And that actually has been a really good biofeedback tool for us. We've got a lot from that. You know, you're able to say to a kid, look, round 3, you can turn this around, everything's looking really good. Conversely, we're able to pull fighters out if we think they're being overwhelmed physiologically, because there's no point putting anyone at risk, especially in heavy spar sessions. So we're kind of using it in a lot of different ways. The Moxie kind of breed. So you put them in a box at night in our gym, and you wake up the following morning, there seems to be another one or two have suddenly appeared. That's kind of how much we're using them. I think, and we all know this, I think we're just at the cusp of things we're learning physiologically. And I think things like profiling fat max and all these things are really exciting, because I think that's going to open up a whole new world of zoning and metabolic and adaptations. And I think it's a very exciting time with the Moxie. But it is sometimes a complete bastard to understand what's happening. It's kind of, to use a Glasgow term, I think the other issue at the moment with Moxie is a lot of people jumping on Moxie, throwing them on people's legs in sparring sessions, but not really understanding what's happening, because it's not always easy. And I think we have the benefit, and I was speaking to Evan about this before, we have the benefit, I could have a boxer 4 days a week on a Moxie over a massive amount of testing. So by the end of 8 weeks, I could have like 60 to 70 sessions on that athlete. So I'm really able to profile in really quite specifically to what I'm seeing, versus if I was only seeing that athlete maybe once or twice in a camp, in which case I think it's very difficult to get a lot of what's occurring. But yeah, so we use them a lot actually. So I just wish Hyperfix was much cheaper to buy.
You know what? I just went to the pharmacy today, and I bought 8 rolls of tape, and to my big delight, the pharmacy person looked at my shirt and she was like, "Oh, you're a coach." Oh, Goog's got it too. The pharmacy lady said, "Oh, you're a coach. You have a company. We can make an account." And I was like, "I could get a discount off of that." So that tape. Well, that's fantastic. Let's do it. So that was the win for my day. And Andrew, I'm glad you tied that in. So both of you, Gug and Andrew, using those heavily for monitoring, which is super interesting. Beyond the testing, really day to day, looking at how trends are moving. Evan, same question for you, with the added question of how the fuck do you get good intercostal measurements with your Moxies?
Do I get good what?
Intercostal measurements with your Moxies. Help us, please.
Okay, so yeah, we'll touch on the intercostal measurement second, because I get this question probably 10 times a week via email, text, everything. So we'll cover that next. But basically, I think just by virtue of the capacity that I work with combat sport athletes, this doesn't apply across the board, but for that population specifically, almost everything that I'm doing is as a consultant. So what I'll do is the only time I really see people in person is when I do initial testing, but oftentimes we're getting these groups outfitted with their own Moxies. So what I'll do is I'll typically educate their coaches or their staff on how to use the Moxies to essentially do everything that Andrew and Gug already said with trying to kind of manage the day to day. Most of what I'm doing on my end is data analysis. So I primarily come in doing load management for them using the Moxies. And this is one of those things where Moxies become such a ubiquitous tool in what I do that people are like, what does a Moxie do? I want to get one. I'm like, what doesn't it do in some capacity? Like, you could assess people, you could auto-regulate training, you could manage loads, you could identify fat max. There's so many different things that it's hard to say what we do with it specifically, but with fighters, I'm primarily doing load management, talking about some of the things that we had touched on earlier. I'll interpret assessment data, and I'll also do some data analysis on the back end. So essentially creating stats for a specific fighter. So if their coaches identify that this is a guy that needs to improve his VO2 max and he's utilization limited, on the back end, I'll take some of his relevant training data and some certain physiologic metrics, some with Moxie, some with other tools. And on the back end, I'll scatter plot those things out and look at them over time to make sure that they're getting the right trends. So just using like basic data science tools. Then on the intercostal measurement though, because this is the real kicker. One, I'll say not everyone could get a clean intercostal measurement. So there is some anthropometry that comes into this. If someone, just the position of their rib cage is, I don't know if it's good, bad, whatever it is, or if their body fat percentage is a little bit higher, you're not going to get a clean measurement. But what I'll typically do for someone is I'll have them put their arm over their head and bend laterally so they could get a nice deep stretch and you could see the separations of the ribs and intercostals. Then we'll find, starting at the bottom of their rib cage, we'll trace it up with our fingers and find the intercostal space, the 7th and 8th intercostal space. And then what you'll do is you'll get the Moxie right in there and make sure that you're getting a clean SMO2 and THB reading, and then have someone kind of like purse their lips. So if you pretend you're like blowing up a balloon, like, so it's creating some resistance to breathing, and do like 5, 10, 15 aggressive breaths with pursed lips. So it's creating some resistance for you to breathe against. And the reason that we do that is we want to see, are you getting some respiratory muscle desaturation there? And if you are, we're getting a good placement. If they do that and you're not seeing any drops in SMO2 and you're not seeing THB go up, showing some vasodilation, then you just need to play with the placement a little bit. So you either have to go up or down or left or right a little bit. And then once you find that spot, I've done this for myself. Sometimes I'll convince other people to do it. Take a Sharpie and just draw a rectangle around the Moxie where it is. And now you know your sensor placement. So each time now you just slap it on, and hopefully if you do this enough for an athlete, they just chronically have a rectangle with a Sharpie on their rib cage and they know where to place the sensor. So that's my secret sauce for getting a respiratory muscle measurement.
Yeah, I like it. I know Ben House had even talked about getting a little tattoo on his VL to make sure.
That's awesome.
I hope he was joking. I hope he was joking, but I couldn't.
Yeah, we're doing a study right now, so I have subjects coming in every few days, and I've Sharpied people with the Moxie. I'm like, okay, we want it on the same spot on your vastus medialis every time. Like, we're just going to Sharpie you day one, and you're just going to have this for the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, I've Sharpied as well. Sharpie is a good idea because you don't have to go too extremely. You can just we just do small dots, and you know, it does
you
work.
can even just get the corners, so it's like
and that's it. Yeah. So we do Sharpies, intercostal Sharpies. People are not that keen on though, I've discovered.
Well, what you have to do is
tattoos maybe the way forward though.
What you have to do is like, yeah, sure, you draw the rectangle, but then do like some cool design around it. So it's like, it's a whole thing. It looks like a nice artistic piece.
Yeah. Well, that's good, Evan. That way we also got a little tutorial on how to actually get a good intercostal measurement here on the podcast. Guys, I know you soon have to run. I had a really good question from Nicholas Ott, who's a national coach in France, MMA, I believe. So I believe we answered most of his question throughout the chat today, but he had an opening part that I wanted to share with you guys and let you answer. His question was, how do you reconcile the fact that the limiting factor isn't going to be widely dependent, or okay, I'll rephrase just so that it makes sense. How do you reconcile the fact that the limiting factor is going to be widely dependent on the type of fight that you're having, and consequently what that most of the time you're going to be out of breath when you're not controlling the fight. So I'll let Gug go first and just tell me what you think of this. And again, Nicholas, I really appreciate your long questions. He was asking about Moxie and how to use it during sparring and different types of testing. But again, we've answered that. So Gug, I'll let you answer that part of Nicholas's question.
This is a useful question to minding better around the coach role. What I mean? I mean that assessing our athlete is fundamental to understand his physiological profile, to be able to understand how we can train him better, considering his fever profile, for example, and this better adaptation to training strategy in direction of strength and conditioning, in direction of technical, tactical activities. So limiting factor related to fever types depends on what we want to minding it around. For example, if we are respecting adaptation after assessing, limiting factor are a class of factors that we have to consider to focus the goal and to reach the goal. But this limiting factor can be a very, very, very bad aspect if a match is going on the direction of this limitation, starting from the fiber type. But
sorry, I'm sorry to cut you off. I think you understood fiber type, and I meant fighting type, or the type of fight that one gets into. So
fighting type.
And I guess, yeah, sorry, that's probably more on the MMA side than on the although there's definitely styles of boxing, but maybe to a larger extent in MMA. So I think the question was around how do you factor that in, depending on how you're going to fight. Your limitations might show up differently. What do you think of this?
Okay, I starting from the biology, so it's
exactly.
It's a too long path. But it's a clear relationship between what we are saying before and what we have to consider now. It's clear that the fighting profile and the sport profile has typical specific expectation, and the limiting factor in this case simply define my athlete like a high profile athlete for this fighting sport, a medium or a low profile. So we have to understand better our athlete to understand where is located, like high, medium or low profile, and training him in his real reality. It's difficult to be an Olympic champion if I'm too close from the medium statistical parameter. For example, during last Olympic Games in Tokyo, we had a fast runner in 400 hurdles race, but his stance is lower than Kasser Warholm. So he went to Tokyo knowing that he cannot be the Olympic champions. So a limiting factor of a specific fighting class are simple the way to understand my athlete profile, and they are fundamental to be assessed. Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought that was a very good answer, Andrew.
Okay, so this is like best laid plans. They never really happen. So when we work, I mean, I worked quite a lot at a straight blast gym, affiliated gym for quite a lot of years. So one of the things we always looked at was the difference between the range. So on the striking range, on the outside, you get your outside lines of attack, so you get plenty of times to look at your breathing. Now the research is pretty clear. We know that peak heart rate is going to be way probably above 180 plus. So you're always going to be in this position where you're going to be constantly heavily breathing and everything else. So breath control is really critical, especially for striking, the point of contraction when you impact. So what I always say to MMA guys is you want to be able to control the space and control the distance in order to control breathing. So if you can utilize your striking to maintain the outside position and keep space when you need it, then you can down-regulate and recover a little bit. It's the same in boxing. As soon as you start hitting the more the kind of Greco-Roman positions, the overhooks, underhooks, and you start into the clinch, that can be a very, very draining position because you've got weight placed on top of you. This comes down to me, a lot of it comes down to technical coaching, making sure the shoulder's in a higher position so you've got leverage control and everything else. So it comes down to like basics of wrestling and Greco and things like that. And then as you hit the ground, you hit your PGD, you start going through your passes and your guards. It comes down to just breath and management. So for me, you're not going to be able to dictate your fighter type because you may have a Muay Thai striker in front of you that suddenly maybe is very well versed on the ground as well. So it comes down to training protocols. It comes down to drilling it and using things like the Moxie to look at how the body's responding in the striking phase and how does it change as the range starts to close down. So you start hitting like sprawls and things like that, how the recovery rate's coming off of sprawling and how are you able to control when you're on the bottom position, because it's much easier. A lot of times you're on top and you're in control, especially on the ground, than when you're on the bottom. So for me, this is more a coaching thing than a fight per se. It's about drilling the physiological adaptations for each of the ranges and understanding when to back away and control your breathing and regulate everything, when to step up a gear, which is sometimes a big problem as well, and just how to manage positions, because MMA is so chaotic that you have to be well versed. Nowadays, years ago, you could get by with just being a striker or a wrestler. Now you really have to be well versed in all three ranges, which is what I was garbage at it. So I think for Nicholas, that was right, yeah. I think is think about the coaching structure and what he's trying to achieve with the fighter so that he can be competent at rest rates and recoveries in all of the particular ranges and control the sphere. There's interesting methods on cooling between rounds as well. You know, if you look at kind of blood flow and cerebral blood flow and how that affects cognition, you know, on the external carotid artery and, you know, cooling strategies and that, there are other things you can also do between rounds that can really help as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And Andrew, we'll have to dig into the cooling strategies in a future podcast. Evan, I'll let you finish. Evan, I'll let you finish here and answer that question.
Yeah, for sure. So if we envision someone who's ready, relatively well conditioned, before we were talking about getting someone's VO2 max up, and that's more of just like a systemic, energetic currency. But now we're getting to the nuts and bolts of, well, you might be conditioned more broadly speaking, but you can't express your capacity in a certain aspect of the sport. So we could tackle this a few different ways. One is to try and identify when you're grappling, when you're striking, do you have a different energetic limitation than when you're just running on a treadmill or rowing? And this gets down to the nature of the testing that you need to do needs to be specific to the sport. Otherwise, it's not going to carry over. And if that's the case, there are some things that you could do to work on that. But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to what Andrew was talking about, where it's a lot of it is the sport specific competencies. One of the things that you'll notice, particularly in MMA, is someone might not be the most conditioned athlete, but if they have a long history in a certain sub aspect of the sport, they're usually pretty good at expressing that capacity. So if you have a guy that's been wrestling for 25 years, he might not be the most conditioned fighter, but when he's wrestling, he's not going to gas out because he's so good at saving his energy and knows how to position himself and knows how to put pressure on the other athlete and use leverage. So a lot of these aspects of being conditioned for all of the parts of the fight is knowing how to manipulate that. And to Andrew's point, one of the huge things with fighters that anytime I'm watching a fight and I see this, it just makes me so upset, is when you see these guys, when there's a break in the fight and they could kind of get their distance, people in their corner are always screaming for them, calm your breathing down, stop breathing so heavy. And you're like, why are you telling this guy who's hypercapnic, who's been holding his breathing to try and block fights and stabilize his spine, to slow his breathing down? He needs to clear his CO2. And you can't do that when you're in a fight, because if you're taking these nice exaggerated exhales, you're also destabilizing your spine. So a big thing is knowing how to manipulate your breathing within the fight, whether it's a break in the fight or between rounds. Learn how to strategically hyperventilate to clear CO2 and get yourself back down to a baseline. So I think that's like my big picture pieces for that.
Yeah, I love it. And it ties it back all together. And as Brian Kozak would say, if you don't control your breathing is going to control you. Guys, it's been a blast having you all on the podcast today to go through those different topics. A lot of fun for me. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. For the audience, make sure you follow Evan, Andrew, and Gug on the different social media. You'll find all the links in the description of the podcast. If you have follow-up questions, you can reach them on their respective handles. They'll be more than happy to answer you. Again, guys, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah,
well, that's awesome.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right, you guys take care.